Well, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Kirsty Duncan as the next speaker. Kirsty, despite her busy schedule as a member of Parliament in Canada, has been a strong advocate for the science of studying CCSVI and its role in multiple sclerosis. And she's going to talk to us today about that experience she's had and where it's brought her and some of the things that are happening even here today in Poland. Kirsty?
Good morning, everyone, and I'd like to say what an honor and pleasure it is to be here, and it's a particular honor because it's at the crest of Dr. Simka, for whom I have enormous respect. And Dr. Simka, I've heard from patients all across Canada this week, and they've all asked me to send you their best wishes. Before I begin, I'd like to just tell you, I'm to talk about the history, politics, and science of the fight for clinical trials of CCSVI in Canada. Before I begin, I'll give you a bit of my background. I'm a former health professor. Pandemic flu was my research area, particularly the 1918 flu. And years ago, I led an expedition to the Arctic. We exhumed 6 bodies that were buried in the permafrost, and we hoped the frozen ground would preserve the body and the virus. It was a 10-year research study, and that study is really the story of the 1918 flu. It is also the study of that search for the virus, but it's also about the darker side of science. I did write a book, and it's based on those experiences, largely because the world depends on scientific cooperation to protect us from infectious disease threats, as well as to look for new cures to diseases like multiple sclerosis. And that book is really about double dealing, feuding among the lords of science, and how scientific behavior deteriorates when the stakes are perceived as high. I will also tell you, I have a cousin with secondary progressive MS, and she went from perfect, active, strikingly beautiful to a quadriplegic in less than 5 years. My own family's experience with MS is, at first you read all the research, you look all around the world to find some hope, to find some help, and quickly you find there is very little of either. 5 years into her disease, we were told on leaving a Canadian MS clinic, go to Italy for what would become the liberation procedure, and then go to Israel for stem cells. But I'm a scientist. I needed the evidence. A year and a half later, a Canadian journalist reported on Dr. Zamboni's research, and like 75,000 Canadian families, we watched. And my reaction was, interesting theory. I needed the evidence. So I decided I would contact the leading experts. I would read everything I could. I would go to the scientific conferences. I needed to gather the evidence. I was surprised that the Canadian and US MS societies were immediately reticent to even acknowledge this theory, and I wondered what evidence they had gathered. I came to the federal government in order to fight for neurological disease. In the 70s and 80s, our focus was heart and lung health. We've really never had the same focus on the brain. Despite having an aging population with Alzheimer's disease, we're looking at diagnosis in Canada once every 5 minutes today, once every 2 minutes in 30 years, and the cost increasing to $153 billion per year. The first thing I did in Parliament, I was able to get all parties to agree to have a subcommittee on neurological disease. In February of 2010, Canadian physicians had the first opportunity to hear from CCSVI experts. We had Dr. Zamboni, we had Dr. Simka, we had Dr. Hakey. And as I was going upstairs, I met a Canadian doctor, Dr. McDonald, who was interested in the procedure. And I have to tell you, going upstairs, I was skeptical, I was trepidatious, I needed the evidence. And the experts delivered. Doppler, flow diagrams, MRV, the more I listened, the more I was impressed. In Canada, we have to have clinical trials in order to do a new procedure. And based on the evidence I heard at that first conference, I decided to bring the fight for clinical trials to Parliament. But by that time, a highly polarized debate had developed in Canadian society. And the question became, did CCSVI cause MS? Rather than the fundamental question, which should have been, do MS patients improve after liberation? On the one side, there were absolutely the neurologists, and here's one of the comments. I think there's going to be millions of dollars spent looking for a hoax. And on the other side, there were those living with MS. They're courageous, they're tenacious, and they should never have had to fight their disease and fight the system. In May of 2010, my colleague, who is a physician, we both wrote a letter to the minister asking that there be clinical trials and a registry in Canada. Our letter was ignored. I then asked for an emergency debate in Parliament because that 1 month can mean the difference between walking and not walking, or living in care and not living in care. We weren't allowed that, but we were given a 4-hour debate in June. The subcommittee I established, we had 4 meetings on CCSVI. Dr. Zamboni presented, Dr. Simka, Dr. Hakey, Dr. McDonald, and all the experts were ignored. They all said we need clinical trials, and the government ignored them. In the summer, Parliament had shut down, and I went to the leading health officials and I said, why can't we have a registry? Why aren't we tracking these people? And I was told, well, because we don't exactly know what's being done overseas. And I said, well, that's not true. Let me take Poland, for example. Everyone who comes to Poland is seen by a neurologist. They have an MRV, they have a Doppler, they have an eye test, they have pictures before and after the procedure, and they have video. I said, we know exactly what's being done. The request was ignored. Finally, in the summer, a political process was put in place in Canada. There would be a joint meeting between the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, much like the NIH in the United States, and the Canadian MS Society, with touching on CCSVI. Sadly, it was a group with no experts. Dr. McDonald, the only Canadian to have been trained by Dr. Zamboni, and the only one to have done the procedure in Canada, was not invited. No international experts were invited. No international data, no unpublished data was looked at. Nothing from the New York conference, and there were no visits to labs or operating theaters. The entire review looked at a handful of papers, and as a scientist, that's not a very thorough review. There was no questioning of 2 papers that were accepted for publication in an astonishing 6 weeks. After that secret meeting, we were told that there was not enough evidence for clinical trials. At that time, over 1,500 procedures had been done worldwide. Now the estimate is 12,500. We were also told that CCSVI experts were not included for fear of biasing the sample. Surely not including experts has got to be a poor precedent. Over the past year, I'm personally in touch with 1,000 MS patients across Canada. They have my personal email, my phone number, and in May and June, I spoke to them every night from 9 o'clock to midnight, and they emailed from midnight to 4 a.m. as the desperation increased. Of that 1,000, 270 have now been treated. Many are primary and secondary progressive MS. The government's not tracking them, but the patients send me all their information. And what they report is changes in circulation, changes in the color and temperature of the face, hands, and feet, reduction in searing nerve pain, reduction in, it feels like a tourniquet is removed off various limbs, reduction in brain fuzziness, and in some cases, improvements in motor function, vision, and hearing. And I've given you 2 quotes. My left foot woke up, no longer numb. My balance has improved on my left side. And the patient was sort of joking and said, I'm really enjoying these placebo effects. The reality is the political process has failed Canadian MS patients. We have a new scientific working group, and sadly it has the same flaws as the first group, namely no experts, no experience, and many undeclared conflicts of interest. I've asked that each of those experts declare their conflicts of interest as ECTRIMS does. The new group is going to look at interim results of the studies that are being funded by the MS Society. There are 7 studies taking place in North America. They are 7 correlational studies. And some would argue that we already have that information. In New York, last July, Bulgaria, Italy, Kuwait, United States all reported similar data, namely that 87 to 90% of MS patients show 1 or more venous problems. Dr. Simka has shown with angiography perhaps as high as 97%. The point is, Canadian MS patients deserve science. They deserve evidence-based medical practices. And you can't have evidence-based medical practices if your government refuses to collect the evidence, either through clinical trials or a registry. And the reality is our patients have been traveling overseas since January. None of that information has been tracked. And as one neurologist who's been treated said to me, if we had done a registry, would we still be calling this anecdotal stories? The fight is still continuing in Canada. I've asked hundreds of written questions of the government. I take every opportunity to speak on CCSVI. And a few weeks ago, I had Dr. Hakey, Dr. Hubbard, a neurologist from California, and Dr. McDonald come and speak to the members of Parliament and senators to teach them about the science of CCSVI. And we've since asked the Minister of Finance to include money for clinical trials in the next budget. In Canada, what we really need, we have to ensure there's proper follow-up. Our patients come back, and in many cases, they're turned away. They're turned away from doctors, they're turned away from hospitals. Some people have gone 4 times to emerge and still been sent away. We need an advisory panel with real experts, those who have done diagnosis and treatment, and patients who've actually been treated. We need clinical trials in multiple centers across Canada, and we have to track the information. MS patients in Canada want an investigation into how this is handled so badly, how special interest groups co-opted science, how an organization that was supposed to steadfastly advocate for MS patients has flip-flopped on its position, how a political process was used not to do science. And I want to finish by saying thank you to all of you. Thank you for the doctors for your science, your compassion, your courage to be pioneers. I know how hard it is to do cutting-edge research. I came from the outside when I led that expedition. I took 17 men to the Arctic, was their junior by 25 years, and they were the world's leading experts. I spent $85,000 of my own money to do that research. And I know how bruising it can be emotionally, financially, and professionally on the dark side of science. Thank you for standing strong in the face of adversity, for doing science, and hoping eventually evidence over egos, politics, and the various government lobbies will prevail. And my last words are to those living with MS, for your courage and your tireless efforts to bring clinical trials to Canada. You inspire me every day. Thank you.